Welcome to the offices of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. We're very pleased to be hosting this afternoon once again the final press conference of the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Cambodia, Professor Surya Subedi, who, as you know, is today completing his final mission as Special Rapporteur in Cambodia. We are here to hear his final observations and conclusions from this mission. As usual, after hearing a statement from the Special Rapporteur, we will have some time for some questions and answers. If you've all had your photo opportunity, we may begin straight away into the main purpose of today's press conference, which is to hear from the Special Rapporteur. And with that, I'd like to turn over the floor to him.
Thank you, Ms. Wan Hee Lee, for your kind words of introduction. Good afternoon to you all. I would like to thank you very much for coming to meet with me this afternoon. As in the past, I have prepared a written statement outlining the situation of human rights within the country, the challenges facing the country, and the main human rights concerns that I have raised with the government interlocutors during my mission. While reporting, I would be very grateful if you would rely on my written statement as much as possible. Once I have read out my press statement, I would be happy to entertain some questions from you. I am about to complete my 12th and final mission to the Kingdom of Cambodia as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the country. It has been a privilege to serve the people of Cambodia over the past 6 years. At the outset, I wish to express my appreciation to the Royal Government of Cambodia for the positive and constructive cooperation extended to me during this mission. While I was not able to meet with the Prime Minister this time, I very much appreciated the dialogue I had with the government interlocutors, which was candid, cordial, and informative throughout. During this mission, I met with His Excellency Bin Chin, Deputy Prime Minister, His Excellency Mr. Sar Kheng, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Interior, and His Excellency Mr. Mak Sambat, President of the Cambodian Human Rights Committee. I also met at the National Assembly with the leaders of the minority party, including His Excellency Mr. Samrelsi and His Excellency Mr. Khmer. As with all my previous missions, I also interacted with a broad range of stakeholders, including ordinary citizens, youth groups, trade unions, disabled people's organizations, and other civil society organizations, as well as the President of the Bar Association, the President and members of the Cambodian Chamber of Commerce, and members of the international community, including development partners and the United Nations country team. I conducted site visits to Bangkok Lake and Boraikela, and also received a number of individual and group petitions coming from as far as Bihar to bring their cases to my attention. In all of my interactions, I have been humbled by the welcome and appreciation that I have received for my work from the people of Cambodia. I was appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council in March 2009, and by April this year, I will have had the privilege of serving as the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Cambodia for the maximum term of 6 years. Over this time, I submitted 5 substantive reports to the Human Rights Council, each with a thorough analysis of the situation of human rights at each juncture, and taking a macro approach with particular focus on judicial, parliamentary, electoral and land reform. Each of my reports came with a series of recommendations designed to assist the government with its reform agenda and the process of democratization in the country. It is gratifying to me to report that many of my recommendations have been acted upon and that some others are in the process of being implemented. My latest and final report to the United Nations Human Rights Council, submitted in September 2014, focuses on the independence of state institutions, including the possibility of establishing a national human rights institution in compliance with the Paris Principles. In my interactions this week, several interlocutors have asked me to identify key recommendations as I reach the end of my mandate. If I am to choose one recommendation as the sum of all others, it would be that the government should reconsider its aversion to independent institutions. I regret to note, however, that many of the state institutions responsible for upholding people's rights are unfortunately still lacking accountability and transparency needed to command the trust and confidence of the people. Reform has not come to them fast enough, although I recognize noteworthy progress in some select areas. The foundation of the liberal democracy foreseen in the Paris Peace Accords requires a different configuration, which time I believe has now come in Cambodia. At the foundation of liberal democracy lie the doctrine of separation of powers and the principles of checks and balances. In other words, the institutions of the executive that are responsible for implementing government policy and protecting human rights must be held to their responsibilities by independent institutions responsible for monitoring their performance. This is the critical juncture at which I believe Cambodia now stands. I am keenly aware that my mission took place in the aftermath of the shocking events in Paris. No one, least myself, would dispute the need to combat terrorism. I would stress, however, that in doing so, we must be mindful of the lessons of 9/11. Combating terrorism through blatant disregard for human rights only fuels hatred and extremism. Independent national institutions of oversight are the best guarantees against potential abuse of authority in the fight against terrorism. This is why early in my mandate, I decided to focus on the state institutions responsible for upholding human rights. I was often asked by government officials and some others why I was recommending the reform of institutions that are not broken. I was told that there was nothing wrong. For instance, with the National Election Committee, today the veil has been lifted and the weaknesses exposed. The calls for accountability are stronger now than ever, and I am convinced that they will not diminish. The ongoing proceedings at the ECCC is a case in point. It has taken over 20 years since the Paris Peace Accords for accountability to become a priority in Cambodia. The urgency at that time was the establishment and consolidation of peace itself, the natural progression of a country that, having achieved peace and stability, finds itself increasing claims for better governance and justice for all, will be to make meaningful steps towards that. I am confident that Cambodia will ultimately follow this route, and I believe I have contributed to laying the path for it. I am moved by the political developments that have taken place in the country. I had repeatedly called both in public and private, for the creation of a political environment that would enable the leader of the opposition to return to the country from his exile in Paris. And His Excellency Samrensi was granted a royal pardon to enable him to return in time for the elections for the National Assembly in July 2013. Owing to the disputes around the outcome of the election, the country went through yet another period of political instability. I was pleased and relieved when the two sides reached a political deal on 22nd July 2014 to make way for the opposition to join the National Assembly. It gives me a sense of satisfaction that my recommendations on electoral reform seem to have now truly become part of the national agenda. The most noteworthy one being that of granting a constitutional status to the National Election Committee. As the next step, I encourage the two parties to work together to resolve the outstanding differences so that the next elections will not be marred by similar disputes that plagued the July 2013 elections. While the government and the ruling party have a greater responsibility towards ensuring that the promised political, judicial and social reforms will be delivered, the minority party has to take its responsibility equally seriously and ensure that the position that it takes is a principled one and not driven by short-term gains. One of the concerns I have for the future of the country is the possibility of a racial tension between different ethnic groups, and I have thus called upon all sides to do their utmost to make their contribution towards building a tolerant, inclusive and cohesive society. After coming this far in the journey towards good governance, stronger democracy, rule of law and a greater respect for human rights, there should be no room in Cambodian politics for racism, xenophobia and discrimination of any kind on any grounds of race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation or belief. I believe that the new bipartisan parliament understands that the people expect it to function more transparently. A number of new draft laws are reportedly in the pipeline that could potentially have profound implications for democratic expression and participation, including on NGOs, on trade unions and on cybercrime. I urge the Parliament once again to ensure openness and transparency in the legislative process. Convinced that the judiciary is a key institution to ensure the protection of human rights, I dedicated my first thematic report back in 2010 on strengthening the independence and the capacity of the judiciary. The enactment of three fundamental laws on the judiciary, namely the law on the organization of courts, the law on the status of judges and prosecutors, and the law on the Supreme Council of Magistracy, constituted the core of my recommendations on judicial reform. While there were some shortcomings, both in the process and the content of these laws, I am very pleased that the Cambodian court system can finally operate within a clear legal framework. So far, the courts of Cambodia have not delivered justice in the way demanded by all Cambodians. There have been too many human rights violations taking place without anyone being held responsible. I only need to refer to the events of 2nd and 3rd January of last year, during which at least 5 persons were killed, one disappeared, and many were injured. Yesterday was the anniversary of the murder of trade union leader Chia Vichaya. 11 years on, no serious investigation has been undertaken and nobody has been held responsible. The two men convicted were eventually found to be innocent and released in 2013 after many years in prison. There is a general perception that the rich and powerful still avoid justice. I am told that to this day, former Babel city governor Chuk Bandir is openly enjoying a free life despite his conviction and sentencing for the shooting of 3 striking factory workers in 2012, of which he has not served a single day in prison. These are but a few well-known cases that illustrate why the term impunity continues to be used whenever Cambodian justice is discussed. The culture of impunity in this country has been a troubling issue for me, which I have repeatedly raised to the government. I was assured once again during this mission that the violent incidents of January 2014 have been investigated and they will soon be referred to the courts. I of course welcome this development, but hope that I will not end my mandate in April without seeing those responsible being brought to justice. I am saddened to see the courts continue to be used as a means to intimidate those perceived to be critical of the government, such as human rights defenders, land activists, journalists, and trade union leaders, as well as members of the opposition. Threats of or the actual prosecution and imprisonment of people, sometimes veiled under the cover of anti-terrorism measures or insurrection, can only be described as judicial harassment. Some of the examples are as follows.